There is a moment, and if it has not come for you yet, it is coming. There is a moment when you stop asking, why does this keep happening to me? And you start asking a far more dangerous question, why do I keep happening to it? That is the moment I want to speak to tonight, not the moment of breaking. You have already had that one. Some of you had it in a childhood bedroom, with the door pulled shut so no one would hear. Some of you had it at 34, standing in a kitchen that was not yours anymore, holding a phone that had just delivered the same betrayal in a new voice. Some of you are having it right now, sitting in this room, wearing a face that says, I am fine, which is, I promise you, the most convincing mask the human being has ever invented. No, I do not want to speak about the moment of breaking. I want to speak about the moment after. The moment when you finally lift your head from the wreckage of another ending, another abandonment, another person who looked, for a while, like rescue, and you see it, not them, not their face, the pattern, the shape that keeps repeating underneath every face. And in that half second of terrible clarity, something in you goes very quiet, and a voice that is older than your fear says, this was never about them. That is the day I want to talk about. That is the beginning of the only freedom worth having. I want you to sit with me a while, because what I am going to say will not be comfortable, and comfort was never going to save you anyway. Comfort is what kept you circling the same well for years. So we are not here tonight for comfort. We are here for something harder, and in the end, infinitely more merciful. We are here for the truth about why the wounded heart becomes a magnet for exactly the wound it is trying to escape. Let me begin where all real transformation begins, not with blame, but with recognition. You were not born broken. I need you to hear that before anything else, because the whole architecture of what follows depends on it. You were born whole, and something, a hand that should have been gentle and was not, a silence where there should have been a voice, an absence where there should have been arms. Something came early enough and hard enough that a part of you learned, before you had language for learning, that love was conditional, that safety was temporary, that your worth had to be earned moment by moment by reading the moods of people who were supposed to be reading yours. That is not a flaw in your character. That is an intelligent adaptation to an unbearable circumstance. The child who becomes exquisitely sensitive to the emotional temperature of a room is not weak. That child is a genius of survival. That child built, out of raw fear, an instrument so finely tuned it could detect a shift in someone's breathing before the person themselves knew they were angry. And here is the tragedy, and also the doorway. That instrument never turned off. You carried it with you out of that house and into every room you have ever entered since. You call it empathy, and it is, but it is empathy forged in fire, and fire forged things cut both ways. That same gift, that lets you sit with a grieving stranger and feel their grief as your own, that same gift that makes you the one everyone calls at 2 in the morning. That same gift is also the thing standing at the door of your life, waving in every wounded soul who walks past, whispering, this one needs you. This one is safe because he needs you. This one will finally stay because you make yourself indispensable to his pain. You did not choose this consciously. No one chooses their wound consciously. That is precisely what makes it a wound and not a decision. But unconsciously, my friends, you have been building the same room over and over again, decorating it with new furniture, new names, new faces, and calling it a new life, when it was in fact the same theater with a different cast performing the same three-act play: the longing, the merging, the abandonment. And you, backstage every time, asking the same devastating question: what did I do wrong? When the honest question was never about what you did. It was about what you were unconsciously seeking. This is the part no one tells you in the beginning, because it sounds, at first hearing, almost cruel. You did not simply fall into these relationships. Some part of you, not your conscious mind, never your conscious mind. Your conscious mind is the last to know anything important. Some part of you selected them, recognized them, was drawn to them the way a key is drawn to the one lock it happens to fit. There is a reason you can walk into a room of 50 people and, within minutes, find your way to the one person carrying an unhealed version of the very wound your childhood taught you to manage. It is not romantic fate. It is not bad luck repeating itself for no reason. It is recognition, deep recognition, cellular recognition, the recognition of an old and terribly familiar shape. I want to say something now that will either frighten you or free you, and in my long experience, it is usually both at once. The people in your story were never really strangers. They were echoes. Every partner who could not fully arrive, every friend who took more than they gave, every parent figure disguised as a lover, every lover who needed rescuing more than loving, they were not random. They were casting choices made by the deepest, oldest, most wounded part of you, a part that did not want a healthy new relationship at all. It wanted a chance to finally win the old one. It wanted, one more time, to make the withholding parent stay. It wanted, one more time, to be chosen by the version of love that never quite chose you the first time. And so you kept walking, unknowingly, back into rooms built from the architecture of your first wound, hoping that if you just loved hard enough, if you were just good enough, patient enough, understanding enough, this time the story would end differently. It never does. Not because you are unlovable, not because you are cursed. It never ends differently because you are not choosing a future. You are reenacting a past, and no one, I promise you this, with everything I have learned in a long life spent listening to the human soul confess itself. No one heals a childhood wound by finding an adult who will finally almost fix it. You cannot outlove your way out of an old story by casting new characters in the same old roles. The play will run again and again and again, identical in structure, though endlessly different in costume, until someone, until you, stops watching from inside the audience of your own unconscious and starts reading the script from a distance. That is what I mean by seeing the pattern, not seeing the person, seeing the architecture. Now, I want to be very precise here because this next part is where most people, in their pain, go astray. Seeing the pattern is not the same as blaming yourself. Do not, whatever you do tonight, mistake this insight for another whip to beat yourself with. You have already spent years being the one who apologizes first, who assumes the fault is always somewhere inside her, who searches her own soul for the crime that must explain another's cruelty. That habit is not humility. That habit is the wound talking. The wound has always wanted you to believe that if only you could find the flaw and fix it, you could finally control whether love stays or leaves. But love was never a problem of your performance. It never was. The child who was hurt did nothing to deserve it, and the adult who keeps re-encountering echoes of that hurt is not failing a test. She is simply still running old software, written in a year she can no longer even remember, by a hand too young to know it was writing anything at all. So we are not here to blame you. We are here to wake something in you that blame has never once been able to reach. Let me tell you what actually happens on the day the pattern becomes visible, because I have watched it happen in soul after soul, and it always unfolds the same way, however different the details of the outer story. It begins, almost always, with exhaustion. Not the dramatic exhaustion of a single terrible loss, though sometimes it is triggered by one, but more often the quiet, accumulated exhaustion of doing the same emotional labor for the 100th time and simply having nothing left to give it. You find yourself in a familiar scene, the withdrawal, the silence, the subtle cruelty dressed as honesty, the partner or friend or family member who takes and takes while calling it love. And for the first time, instead of leaping immediately into the old, practiced choreography of fixing, explaining, softening, shrinking, you pause. That pause is everything. That pause is the entire revolution contained in a single breath. In that pause, something ancient in you, something that has been waiting a very long time for permission, whispers, I know this. I have been here before. I have been here so many times before that I could recite the next scene without watching it. And in that instant of recognition, a strange thing happens. The emotional charge of the moment, the desperate, gripping urgency that has always propelled you into rescue mode, begins for the first time to loosen its hold. Not because the pain disappears, it does not disappear, but because pain that is witnessed behaves entirely differently than pain that is merely suffered. The moment you can stand a half step back from your own reaction and observe it, ah, there it is. There is the old terror of abandonment. There is the old belief that I must earn my place at this table. The moment you can see the mechanism instead of simply being driven by it, you are no longer entirely its prisoner. You have found, in the middle of the oldest storm of your life, one small dry place to stand. And from that dry place, everything begins to look different. This is what I mean when I speak of the pattern behind every relationship. It is not a curse written into your fate. It is not proof that you are doomed to repeat history forever. It is rather the unconscious mind's oldest and most persistent method of trying to heal itself by dragging the old wound back into the light of a new relationship again and again, hoping this time to finally resolve what could not be resolved the first time it happened. The unconscious does not want to torture you. I know it feels that way. I know, standing inside the wreckage of the fifth relationship that ended exactly like the first, it feels like some malevolent force is orchestrating your suffering for sport. But that is not what is happening. What is happening is far stranger and ultimately far more hopeful. Your own psyche is trying to complete unfinished business. It is trying, in its clumsy, blind, repetitive way, to give you one more chance to do consciously what you could not do as a child, to protect yourself, to speak the unspoken need, to walk away from what should never have been walked toward in the first place. The tragedy is not that the pattern exists. The tragedy is only in refusing to see it, because what is unconscious will always be experienced as fate. It will feel every single time like something is simply happening to you. Bad luck, bad timing, a world that keeps handing you the same betrayal in different wrapping paper. But the instant that pattern is made conscious, the instant you can name it, trace its lineage back to the room where it began, understand the terrible logic by which it once protected a small and frightened version of yourself. The instant you do that, the pattern loses its grip on your fate and becomes instead material for your freedom. What was fate becomes choice. That is not a small transformation. That, I would say, is the entire work of a human life. I want you to understand something about the empath's particular version of this journey because it carries its own unique cruelty and its own unique gift. The trauma born empath does not merely repeat patterns, she absorbs them. She was trained from very early to sense the unspoken emotional weather of everyone around her because her survival once depended on that sensing. And so she walks into adulthood as a kind of open channel, feeling not only her own pain, but everyone else's, often unable to tell where her feelings end and another's begin. This gift, unexamined, becomes a trap of the most exquisite design. She mistakes her capacity to feel someone else's wound for a sign that she is meant to heal it. She mistakes the intensity of her compassion for the presence of real intimacy. She mistakes being needed for being loved, and these are not the same thing, however similar they may feel in the body at 3 in the morning when loneliness makes every warm body look like salvation. But here is what the empath so rarely realizes until the pattern becomes visible. Her sensitivity was never the problem. Her sensitivity is, in fact, one of the rarest and most valuable instruments a human soul can carry. The problem was never that she could feel too much. The problem was that she had never been taught where she ends and another person begins. She had never been shown that she is allowed to feel someone's pain without volunteering to carry it. She had never been told that compassion without boundary is not virtue. It is simply an old wound wearing the costume of virtue, still trying, all these years later, to earn love the only way it ever learned how, by making herself endlessly useful to someone else's suffering. When the pattern becomes visible, this changes. Not overnight. I want to be honest with you, because false promises of instant transformation are simply cruelty wearing the mask of encouragement, but steadily and then eventually completely. She begins to notice the exact moment her body tightens in anticipation of managing someone else's mood. She begins to notice the almost automatic reflex to apologize for taking up space. She begins to notice how quickly she can locate someone else's wound, and how slowly, by comparison, she has ever been able to locate her own. And in noticing, simply in noticing, without yet even knowing what to do about it, she takes the single most important step of her entire life. She becomes, for the first time, the observer of her own story rather than merely its exhausted actor. Now I want to speak plainly about what this means for you, sitting here tonight, whatever room you find yourself in when these words reach you. The day you see the pattern is not the day the pain ends. I will not stand here and lie to you about that. The day you see the pattern is, in fact, often a harder day than any of the days that came before it, because on this day you lose the last comfort of believing it was simply bad luck, simply other people's cruelty, simply a world that has singled you out for suffering. On this day you must accept a harder, and in its own way, a more dignified truth, that you have been, without knowing it, a participant in your own repeated pain, not its author of cruelty, never that, but its unconscious architect, building the same room again and again, because it was the only room you knew how to build. This is not an easy truth to swallow, but swallow it you must, because on the far side of that truth waits the only real power a human being ever has, the power to build something different. And here is the part I most want you to carry out of this room tonight, because it is the part that turns insight into transformation, understanding into freedom, Seeing the pattern is not the end of the work. Seeing the pattern is the doorway into the work. What comes after seeing is harder still, and infinitely more rewarding. It is the slow, unglamorous, daily labor of choosing differently in the exact moment the old pattern rises up and demands, as it always has, immediate and automatic obedience. You will feel it rise. Make no mistake about that. Long after you have understood everything I am telling you tonight, you will still, on some ordinary afternoon, feel the old gravitational pull toward a familiar kind of chaos, a familiar kind of person, a familiar kind of self-erasure disguised as love. That pull does not disappear simply because you have named it. The unconscious does not release its old strategies merely because the conscious mind has grown wiser. It releases them only through repeated, deliberate practice, through choosing again and again in the precise moment of temptation to act from the new understanding rather than the old wound. This is not a single dramatic decision made once and finished. This is 1,000 small decisions made quietly, unnoticed by anyone but you, in moments no one will ever applaud you for. It is choosing silence instead of an anxious text. It is choosing to sit with discomfort instead of immediately soothing someone else's. It is choosing to ask, in the middle of an old familiar longing, am I drawn to this because it is good for me or because it is familiar to me? And having the courage to sit with whatever answer arrives, even when that answer is unwelcome. I promise you this, the pull will grow weaker every single time you do not obey it. Not because you have destroyed the old pattern. Patterns forged in early wounding are rarely destroyed entirely, but because you have finally introduced a competitor into a field where, for your whole life, the old pattern ran unopposed. Every time you choose the new response, you are not erasing the past. You are building a second path through the same forest, a path that, with enough walking, becomes as familiar and as automatic as the old one once was. This is the entire secret of transformation, and it is far less mystical than people wish it to be. It is repetition applied consciously in the direction of your own healing for long enough that the new way becomes, at last, the natural way. I want to talk now about what waits for you on the other side of this labor, because you deserve, after everything, to know that there is another side. On the other side of the pattern is not the absence of feeling. Do not mistake healing for numbness. They are opposites, not cousins. On the other side of the pattern is a different quality of feeling altogether. Feeling that is chosen rather than compulsive. Feeling that flows toward people because you genuinely wish to be near them, not because some old unhealed part of you believes their presence is the only proof that you are worthy of existing. On the other side of the pattern, your empathy remains. In fact, it deepens because it is no longer contaminated by fear, but it stops being a leash around your own neck. You can feel someone's sorrow fully, completely, without believing that feeling it obligates you to fix it, fund it, or sacrifice yourself upon it. You can love without disappearing into the person you love. You can be needed without confusing being needed with being cherished. This is not coldness. I want to say that again, because the wounded heart always fears that healing means becoming someone harder, someone less loving. It does not. It means becoming someone whose love finally has a floor beneath it, instead of an old wound holding it up from underneath, like a trapdoor waiting to open. And there is something else waiting on the other side, something I think matters more than anything else I could say to you tonight. On the other side of the pattern, you finally become capable of real intimacy, not the intensity that so often masquerades as intimacy in the unhealed heart, the drama, the highs and lows, the desperate merging that feels like destiny but is often only the old wound recognizing itself in another wounded stranger. But real intimacy, the slower, quieter, far less cinematic experience of being fully known by someone and staying anyway, of knowing someone fully and staying anyway, without needing the relationship to prove anything about your worth. This kind of love is less dramatic than the love the wounded heart chases. It does not announce itself with fireworks. It arrives, instead, like weather that has finally settled, steady, warm, undramatic, and, for exactly that reason, trustworthy in a way that nothing in your old pattern ever was. I know some of you are sitting here tonight wondering whether it is too late for you, wondering whether you have already spent too many years, too many relationships, too much of your one life building the same room over and over. I want to answer that directly because it is the question underneath every other question in this room. It is not too late. The unconscious does not have an expiration date on its willingness to be understood. The pattern that was written in you at 7 or 11 or 17 can be rewritten at 30 or 45 or 70. The soul does not measure healing in years lost. It measures healing only in the moment the light finally arrives. And that moment, whenever it comes, changes everything that follows it, regardless of how long the darkness ran before it. You are not disqualified from wholeness by the years you spent not understanding your own story. You are only now finally qualified to write its next chapter with your eyes open. I want to leave you, before I close, with what I believe is the deepest truth hidden inside everything I have said tonight. The truth that makes all of this, in the end, not a tragedy, but something closer to a strange and difficult grace. The very sensitivity that made you vulnerable to these patterns is the same sensitivity that makes you capable, once you understand it, of extraordinary depth, extraordinary compassion, extraordinary presence with other human beings. Your wound was never simply a liability. It was also, always, so the raw material of a gift that could only be refined through exactly the kind of suffering you have already survived. The empath who has done this work, who has seen her own pattern and slowly, patiently, unromantically rebuilt her way of loving from the ground up, becomes something the world badly needs. A person who can sit beside another's pain without drowning in it, who can hold space without losing herself in the holding, who has walked through her own darkness thoroughly enough to no longer be frightened by anyone else's. That is not a small thing to become. That, I would argue, is one of the rarer achievements a human life can offer. So here is what I ask of you as you leave this room and walk back into the ordinary evening, waiting outside it. The next time you feel that old, familiar pull toward the person who feels dangerously familiar, toward the situation that has the unmistakable shape of something you have survived before, toward the impulse to make yourself smaller so someone else's storm can pass through you more comfortably. I ask you in that moment to pause. Just pause. You do not have to solve everything in that single breath. You do not have to have the whole of your healing figured out before you take the first step of it. You only have to pause long enough to ask the one question that changes everything. Is this love, or is this the old wound, wearing love's clothing again? Ask it honestly. Ask it without flinching. And then, whatever the answer, have the courage to act from what you now know rather than from what you have always felt compelled to do. That pause, that single, ordinary, unglamorous pause, is the whole of the revolution. It will not look like much from the outside. No one will applaud you for it. There will be no dramatic music, no audience, no witness, but your own quiet, growing self-respect. But I promise you, from that pause, an entirely different life becomes possible. Not a life without pain, because no life is without pain, but a life in which pain is finally met with understanding instead of repetition, with presence instead of panic, with a self that has learned, at last, to stay with itself even when nothing and no one else does. You were not born to spend your whole life reenacting your wound in the disguise of other people's faces. You were born, like every human soul before you, to eventually turn and look directly at the pattern that has been running your life in the dark, and in the turning, in the simple, terrifying, liberating act of finally seeing it, to take back the authorship of your own story. The day you see the pattern is not the end of your struggle, it is the very first day of your freedom. And that day, my friends, for some of you, that day is today.